introduce Kopano and Glenn, and so I'll just walk through very quickly the announcement, just 2 or 3 that we have, and then the question and answers will be handled by my colleague, the Senior Program Manager, Dr. Christoph Paul. We do welcome all the colleagues that have come. And I saw one of those persons. Those of you who have been at Stellenbosch University, you know that he gave a lot of trouble as a dean of the humanities of humanities there. And Henny, welcome. And I'm sure that the number of colleagues that have come to. We've got about 250 individuals that have signed up, and probably by now it's coming to 400, and it's no pressure at all. But so the first announcement that I want to make is that on Tuesday we had a seminar, and I forgot to mention that Akili, one of our Isolomso fellows from Cameroon, had actually sent an apology, so that's why he wasn't there. He was attending a PhD defense, and I wanted to ask whether the student passed. Where is he? Okay, so as I said, it's going to be the last public lecture, and we have 2 upcoming book launches in May by both of them are our former fellows, or our fellows, because you can never be a former fellow. Origin Africa by Jonathan Kingdon. We had an 86-year-old fellow last year, and he was the most active, more than the young fellows. And we will then have Darius and Catherine Brubeck playing The Changes, Jazz at an African University and On the Road. So we're looking forward to those book publications. And so other than that, I would like to welcome you all and thank in particular the 2 colleagues that have accepted to present the public lecture. May I now introduce Professor Ronel Carolinson, who is going to introduce the 2 colleagues. Ronel is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch University, and so that's why she has the permission to introduce these 2 colleagues. So you can actually decide to disagree with them. She also served as the Vice Dean, Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Education, and has chaired the Division for Community and Social Psychology of the Psychological Association of South Africa. So she knows all the types of psychologists. She should be fine. She's a South African National Research Foundation rated researcher and holds the 2016 Psychological Association of South Africa Award for Excellence in Teaching Psychology in Higher Education. She was a visiting professor at Stanford University, university's big overseas community engagement program in Cape Town, and for 2021 and 2022, she was a Fulbright Research Scholar. So I think that she's setting the standards already high for the presenters. Her research expertise and publications explore critical community and decolonial approaches to teaching psychology with a strong interest in youth citizenship and identities in higher education. So if you've seen the youth doing toy, she's partly to blame. And on that note, I would like to request Ronel to come and introduce the 2 colleagues. Thank you.
What an honor for you to ask me to introduce you, Kopano and Glenn. You know, you've probably read, just this amazing work that both of you are working on. But driving here, during the course of the day, driving to Stellenbosch, I thought about where is it that I met Glenn and heard of Glenn and Kopano. And I'll start with Glenn. In 2015, I read a monument. I'd seen Glenn around at the Psychological Association as an invited guest at the conferences. But then in 2015, I read a career-changing special edition in the Journal of Political Psychology that Glenn edited. One of the most significant authors on African soil that works in decolonial psychology, Hussein Bulan. I don't know what you did, Glenn, but you managed to get him to write, as usual, a brilliant paper, which I still quote today. Then, and I'm just going to quote one more paper, or talk about one more paper. In that very same special edition, and it's not the only one he's done, in that very same special edition, he wrote about what does one do to decolonize psychology. And it was done in such a simple way, not simplistic, but simple way, that I thought, wow, this is a fantastic model to draw into an undergrad text that I was fortunate to co-edit with a colleague when I with a few colleagues when I co-edited a book on community psychology for the South African context last year. So Glenn, thank you for your work and your work to come. I'll talk a little bit about that now. Kopano. Kopano was a most impressive character in books because Kopano spoke about masculinities. And when all of us were talking about feminism, he said, but yeah, I'm going to open up an area of work that speaks about masculinities, and I'm going to look at black men. And I thought, yo, this is kwai. And then Kopano's work on thinking about psychology from where we are is groundbreaking globally. But it's rooted in African soil. And then I was amazed I sat, we pick up our kids from school, and I sat one day and I wondered, does the school know who they have lurking on these premises? Because Kopano, my daughter told me one day and didn't know who Kopano was, and she said, Mom, there's the school guy. He's a dad. There's the school guy that comes in these bright, cool African print pants. We don't see you in those enough, Kopano. Stellenbosch mustn't change that, eh? So there's this guy. I said, I know exactly who you're talking about. That is the Professor Kopano Ratele. She, oh, wow. And then apparently she, in a usual way, went to ask you about who you are subsequently. So there we go. But to be more serious, there is no, this institute, STIAS, does amazing work in terms of the fellows. It invites to work here, to think here, to create here. And I don't know if I've ever attended a joint presentation, how significant that your joint connections in thinking about how to undo and redo social psychology by looking at its texts happens on African soil. So thank you, STIAS, for doing this, giving these two scholars this amazing opportunity to do this work jointly. It is much needed in a discipline that still individualizes who we are, what our experiences are, and what we can do. So thanks again for doing this. So now I'll say a little bit about Kopano. He teaches African and decolonial and critical social psychology. He's done a series of books you can read, and his work on fatherhood has been groundbreaking. Part of it cuts away at the ongoing and denigrating and humiliating constructions that people have about black men and fatherhood. And that is what Kopano tries to undo in one strain of his work. Now, Kopano is not only an author, he is a personality, no? On radio. So he does a radio show with Koketso Sachane, and what a great way to try and influence, not to try and influence, to impact, really, the way in which the lay public think about fatherhood and what it is and what it can be. Because I think in decolonial work, we always think about what can be in the future, right? So, Glenn is a professor of psychology at the University of Kansas, and I thought, shall I say this? But I will. You know, I've never been to Kansas, Glenn, but one of the things from my childhood, one of the books from my childhood, and you know what I'm going to say, that comes up when we think about, I always think of Dorothy, you know, in The Wizard of Oz. But then I thought, you know what, that's completely appropriate, because here we do have a wizard from Kansas. So Glenn's work focuses on Africa-centering psychology, and he works extensively with colleagues across the globe in doing just that. I'm not going to talk about the multiple, special editions, books you have done. What I want to do is to say very briefly that I am looking forward to the joint work that you are going to produce in looking at books from which psychology is taught. Because that, of course, is how we regenerate the canon. And what you are going to do to undo and remake that canon. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Ronel, you have stolen all my jokes. So when we finished putting together the presentation, I realized to my dismay that I had forgotten a lesson, an advice from my son about presentations. Once again, he says you can't expect people to sit for 30, 40 minutes listening to you and never say one funny thing about your subject. He's a high schooler, he's 14, and they can be brutal in their observations. But I think he's right, and I agree with him. So Glenn and I decided that we could do this. All we could do is warn you that there are no jokes in this presentation. It's all serious from now on. I would like to thank STIAS for this opportunity, but I'm not going to tell you about how I got to be here, and it is a wonderful story which we will write one day if we ever write a memoir, and that I could be here with Glenn. I am barely 10 days here, just about. Actually, this is my 10th day here. And then the first 10 days, you throw me in to present a public lecture. So thank you once again. And thank you all for being here, and in person and virtually, all of you who have made time to attend this. Ronelle, thank you so much for doing this. It was fantastic. Let me give you a plot line. In the first part of this presentation, I will speak about Africa, African-centered psychology. I will anchor this section on an individual who seems to have been surprised by what he called an unexpected public recognition. Glenn will come here and will pick up the thread in the next section, part 2, and speak on decolonial theory and psychology. I will come back and I give you a conceptual presentation on racism. So anybody who came to listen to about masculinity, we decided, is it masculinity? Is it love, which I write a few things about, or is it racism and well-being? So that section, part 3, draws on the work on racism that we've been doing with, Glenn and I have been doing with the colleagues in the READSURA Decolonial Collective. Some of them might be listening, Shana Safla and Gita Reddy, in collaboration with Nick Malherbe. And then in the final part, Glenn will come and present empirical work on well-being using a decolonial Africa-centering perspective. And that work draws on his collaboration with colleagues in Ghana, mostly. So that's the plot line. Toussaint was a full man. This is what C.L.R. James writes about the former slave who became a general in the Haitian Revolution. What does it mean to be a full man? What is the experience of being a full person in a world in which one was enslaved, dehumanized? And the question can be extended to other subaltern or subjugated subjects and contexts. What does it mean to be black, to be questioning, to be woman, to be fluid, to be non-binary, to be trans, to be gender non-conforming, to be queer, or other in other ways, in a world that you are a non-being. I'm sorry about that. So in this part of the presentation, we restrict ourselves to a question that occupied the first clinical psychologist half a century ago. What is the psychology of black experience in a white supremacist world? And then he said, it is not always cordial to remind people that they colonized one, which could be my favorite understatement of the whole year. It takes a certain consciousness to digest the fact that one is white in a white supremacist world, just as it takes a certain way to digest that you're a man in a patriarchal, violent society. But it remains fundamentally true to insist on the recognition of the historical fact of colonialism. This psychologist also said, since the historical exigency may make certain currently less understood realities about being black in the world understandable. So that question runs through our presentation, how to think psychologically, you could extend it to sociologically, about the world from Africa, from African settings. That question is stitched into the same clause as the question with which that psychologist had troubled himself. The psychologist in question is Noel Chabani Manganyi. Born in Mavembe in the Northern Province, he turned 83 exactly a month ago on the 13th of March. He entered the University College of the North, aka TURF, or TURF Loop, soon after the passing of the University Extension Act of 1959. In fact, he was number 11 on the register of the first students who entered there in 1960. He tells us in his 2016 autobiography memoir. He graduates in 1962. By the way, TURF was one of those colleges called the Bush colleges. And it was reserved for black ethnic groups in particular. And my pronunciation, if anybody is listening, would be bad here. Chichonga and Chivenda and Sepedi speaking students. Interesting fact. For those who are trying to get your first job or a new one, Manganyi tells us he failed his psychometric test. Manganyi failed a psychometric test in 1963 while applying for a job at the NIPR, the National Institute for Personnel Research. The NIPR was a leading research institute at that time. Another interesting thing Manganyi says is, contrary to what, I don't know whether Seth Cooper is listening to this, Seth Cooper and Lionel Nicholas, who passed away a few years ago, have written, Manganyi says the NIPR was not so bad for him. Now, this has resonance for me because I get this question quite a lot. How is Stellenbosch? I say, oh, that's a joke right there. I say, racist, but. Well, Manganyi goes on to register for further degrees, doing his master's degree at UNISA, and the topic was called comparative. His topic was a comparative study of the psychological needs of a group of African salesmen and factory workers. And this has implications of what he does a few years later. Graduates in 1969 during a winter graduation reserved for Africans. So we come from that world at UNISA. He gets a first job. In the second job, he goes on to work at Ellerins. Anybody remember that? Ellerins. But he's pushed out, kicked out, because almost the first month, he's asked to investigate why the African salesmen at Ellerins, you remember them, right? They would go from house to house. Why was there such a high turnover? And he finds that, guess what? Because the white managers were racist. And then the Ellerins brothers did not like that, and he gets basically chucked out. What should be of immediate interest to younger people who are listening to this would be professional psychologists, but also anybody who's interested in the profession of psychology, is the next phase of Manganyi. He approaches the psychiatry department at Wits, University of Witwatersrand, to seek admission because he sees that his route to industrial psychology is closed. He goes to clinical psychology and seeks admission. As you may know, during apartheid, psychiatric hospitals such as Tara and Weskopis, I don't know about Lentegeur here, were closed for black people, right, for Africans. And they catered primarily for white patients. Africans were not meant to be clinical psychologists. So he goes there, and with some white accomplices, with support of white accomplices or allies, as we call them, he gets admitted to be the first intern at Chris Hani Baragwanath. It was called Bar at that time, but not in the psychiatry department, in the neurosurgery department. This is where he finds friendly and welcoming environment. But there are no psychologists or psychiatrists who would supervise him. But as I say, the psychiatry, the neurosurgery department was a welcoming space. Even then, he would say this, that like South African life broadly, all the statutory racist prohibitions and practices of the apartheid era were enforced unreservedly at Bara. So you do an internship, but you find that there are segregated residences for white and black professionals, racially segregated eating facilities, ablution and toilet facilities, as well as race and ethnic-based salary scales. After the internship, Manganyi becomes the first clinical psychologist at Bara, and then he writes, in retrospect, the experiment of placing an African intern in a teaching neurosurgery ward in Soweto Hospital, in the late 1960s did, contrary to all expectation, work to the satisfaction of those closely concerned with the matter at the time. In fact, the experiment worked so well that on completion of the mandatory year-long internship, I was appointed the first full-time clinical psychologist at Bara. Manganyi received his PhD 71 at UNISA, but no university to employ him, including his alma mater. And he has a whole story about why, because he was not, well, let's say, subservient when he was undergraduate. He was, in fact, an SRC member when, during those years undergraduate. I'll leave it here because I want to move to this part, being black in the world. The book was published 50 years ago, 1973. Part of the reason for the spotlight, for what I just did right now, is to put a spotlight and honor this book, critically honor it, appreciatively, but also critically. But this is such a poor gesture. So Ronell, Hugo, somewhere, Garth, Norman, Sipo, Peace, everybody who I've spoken to in the last few days. So thank you for agreeing to honor Manganyi. Psychologists are not very historically minded, by the way. You know, it's a kind of modernist, forward-looking discipline. So just to create a gathering for this work. In this, then, his first book, this is where Manganyi speaks directly of the psychology of black experience. This is how he begins the book. Being black in the world is intended as a contribution to the growing body of books and papers on the black experience. He also says this: it is here on the African continent where the great and intricate drama of being black in the world is taking place. About the psychology of being black in the world, it might be necessary to say something and to repeat it, as a matter of fact, because I've said it several times, that though the making black of psychology and our society might go some way towards creating a decolonial psychology in Africa, decoloniality entails, as we will hear, more than racial and linguistic representation. Manganyi went on to do several other things and publish other books. For example, when he could not get a job, he went to Yale to do a postdoc. I mentioned this to signal something else, the global dimensions and potential of Africa-centric psychology. African-centric psychology, as we have said in several places, is not a psychology of Africans or about Africans, but about the world with Africa at the center. So in 1976, then Manganyi goes to the University of the Transkei, becomes head of department, later becomes dean. You might know this, he becomes vice chancellor and then vice chancellor afterward, which is a great way. Chancellor then becomes vice chancellor and then deputy vice chancellor later in life. You don't have to be been born in Mavemba, in the northern province, in a rural area, or during apartheid to appreciate how colonial and apartheid racism and white supremacy disfigured black lives and black experience. And also the struggle for an Africa-centric psychology. The struggle, as someone said in Maputo a long time ago, continues. And the student fallist revolt of 2015-2016 embodied that ongoing struggle. The struggle, the challenge, as far as we see it, Glenn and I, and a number of you here, is that African psychologists have been and continue to be forcefully interpellated, to use that word, interpellated by colonialism into reading human lives, human experiences through Western psychological lenses. I teach this, literally, I teach this And I feel this disembodied sense every time I teach people, as though I am not here. An inescapable fact of the lives and work of African psychologists, African social scientists really, here and elsewhere, is that because of colonialism, many of us are forced to negotiate these two worlds, these two psychology worlds, a hegemonic Western one and an African one. Language, the fact that we're here, and Stellenbosch is a great example of that, that here we don't use our mother tongues to teach and learn, but also that some of us use English to speak to each other when we are not compelled to, is arguably the most obvious legacy of colonialism, and in particular, what is called colonial mentality. Related to this, a protagonist, somebody I'm debating quite a lot with, Augustine Noye, writing on methodology and language, writes of, I'm sorry about that, I don't know where I touch. Writing about language, Augustine Noye says this. Says, through the methodology of re-studies, in which people will be studied in the language they and the native African psychologists understand, researchers of African psychology hope to come with revised conclusions that offer an opportunity to represent in a more accurate light the taken for granted images of Africans propagated by colonialist investigators. One of the tasks then, as far as we see it, is to continue to disentangle African-centric knowledges from hegemonic Western knowledges. Something about the locus of enunciation. African-centric psychology is expressive of this idea, the idea of locus of enunciation. It is not so much this idea, and certainly not merely knowledge about, that is African-centric psychology, knowledge about Africans and Africa. It is rather knowledge from, understanding from, looking from African setting. It challenges the idea in the global Euro-American-centric modern order of gazing out at some exotic spectacle that is Africa. So rather than, it is standing within a situation and looking back at the texts, looking back at the world that's looking at you, to understand this global Euro-American-centric modern order with new lenses. In this last slide, so here is, and Len will take this from me, the work that Manganyi started and several others have continued for an Africa-centric psychology, essentially so that we can have a psychology that is more situated, less extroverted, to use the philosopher Pauline Hontonji, less extractive, anti-colonial, less Western, less American-centric, less Eurocentric, more global, and decolonial. And this part, coloniality and decoloniality, are what Len will take up now.
So in case it wasn't clear, another way to understand an African-centric psychology is in terms of our slide background motif. To the extent that African settings inform knowledge production in Whitestream psychology, it's typically as a peripheral site for exotic investigations on the fringes of Eurocentric research agendas. An African-centering perspective upends or overturns this frame. It treats African settings as privileged sites for thinking about the present and future of humanity. As Kopano noted in his final point, a particularly important insight from this perspective concerns the coloniality of modernity. As many of you are well aware, recent movements in South Africa, the US, and across the globe have responded to the racist violence of the Eurocentric modern order with calls to decolonize public space, the university, and knowledge itself. Although certainly relevant to such considerations of decolonization, the idea of decoloniality that we want to discuss is somewhat different. Decolonial theorists make a distinction between colonialism, a discrete historical period with a more or less definite ending, and coloniality, modes of thinking and being associated with European colonial domination that have persisted long after the formal end of colonial rule. In its most obvious form, coloniality persists in relations of power that naturalize colonial domination and install colonial institutions and their post-colonial custodians as legitimate owners of resources plundered from indigenous peoples. Less obviously, perhaps, coloniality persists in particular forms of knowledge and ways of being that colonial power imposed on the world as a hegemonic standard. As Nelson Maldonado Torres put it, coloniality is maintained in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. This concept of coloniality is a first important contribution of decolonial theory. A second contribution is an emphasis on the central role of coloniality in the reproduction and production of the modern global order. Decolonial theorists use this phrase, modernity/coloniality, to emphasize this link. This phrase positions coloniality as what Mignolo has called the darker side of modernity, the typically obscured shadow of racist violence that supports and is inseparable from, not merely coincidental to, the shiny project of modern growth and development. Applying this discussion to concerns of psychology, we can extend the idea of coloniality as the darker side of modernity to consider implications for the coloniality of being as the darker side of modern individualist lifeways. Our reference to modern individualist lifeways reflects the lineage of two different ideas. One of these ideas is a tradition of work associated with modernization theory and its intersection with psychology, especially in the work of Alex Ankelis on individual modernity. Work in this tradition proposes a reciprocal relationship between modern individualist habits of mind and a notion of modern societal progress. So in one direction, this perspective suggests that modern individualist habits of mind are a product of modern institutions. They develop through engagement with the scaffolding of modern ecologies. Things like education institutions that preach open system thinking, or baseline level of collective material affluence that affords a sense of abstraction from context and freedom from constraint. In the other direction, this perspective suggests that modern individualist habits of mind are also a source of modern societal progress. They provide the cognitive and motivational tendencies, like an entrepreneurial spirit of creativity or exploration, and other open system habits of mind necessary to stimulate economic growth. And of course, the flip side of this formulation is the position that underdevelopment, to use the sort of infamous or notorious words of Lawrence Harrison, is a state of mind. That deviations from modern individualist habits of mind are not merely a product, but also a source of societal underdevelopment. The other lineage that informs our use of modern individualist lifeways is a tradition of work in the field of cultural psychology. Rather than understand modern individualist lifeways as a just natural standard, cultural psychology perspectives emphasize that they emerge from a particular context, specifically the product of engagement with settings that are Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. In a word, weird. Rather than underdeveloped or immature versions of human potential, a cultural psychology perspective holds that African and many other majority world lifeways reflect an understanding of the world in terms of the ontological priority of the social, of things social, an experience of self and other in terms of embeddedness in context. And that these interdependent forms of self, to use the phrase of Marcus and Kiriyama, constitute viable modes of being. Okay, so although these perspectives of cultural psychology have illuminated the weirdness of what you might call Whitestream psychology and facilitated the growth of a more cultural psychology that's attuned to the mutual context of person and context, they tend to emphasize philosophical foundations of modern individualism and they tend to obscure its political economic foundations. African epistemic locations provide an antidote to these points of ignorance in hegemonic psychology. They provide a standpoint from which to better appreciate the coloniality that's inherent in these modern individualist lifeways. To return to this modernity coloniality framework, the idea is that modern individualist psychological development of a weird minority, which you might understand as the world on the right of this photo, or sorry, the left of this photo, requires and reproduces the psychological and material underdevelopment of the global majority, which you might understand as the right side of this photo. In the words of Somali psychologist Hussein Bulhan, the dominant weird minority can extol the ethic of individuality and search for individual autonomy because their collective liberty is already realized. Their collective freedom and individual rights essentially boil down to an absence of restraint from the full enjoyment of privileges and possibilities that too frequently amounts to an absence of restraint from imposing their will and interest on others. In short, their collective liberty was obtained through violence, and their individual rights are but condensed social violence. So to summarize, I've distinguished the concept of coloniality from colonialism. I've discussed the relationship between coloniality and modernity, and I've applied this core idea to the modern colonial individualist lifeways that are the focus of most knowledge in Whitestream psychology. What's left is to implicate Whitestream psychology as a key site in what decolonial theorists refer to as the coloniality of knowledge. Perhaps more than any other discipline, I mean, you could argue about some other disciplines, but I think psychology has, maybe a leading role in this enterprise. Psychology has served as a cheerleader or evangelist for modern individualist mentalities, as a blueprint for a just and prosperous future. So how does this evangelism for modern individualist mentalities contribute to epistemic violence? First, it does so through the violence of epistemic exclusion, when researchers restrict their focus to settings that are weird. Researchers also enact epistemic violence through intellectual imperialism, when they interpret the modern colonial lifeways that they observe in weird settings as descriptive and prescriptive norms, and then impose these without regard to context as universal standards for how normal people are and should be. Researchers enact what Thomas Teo refers to as epistemological violence when they measure others against these standards and find them deviant or backward, when the data allow for less pathologizing interpretations. But perhaps the most insidious form of epistemic violence in psychology is the naturalization of these modern colonial individualist mentalities and lifeways. Psychologists whitewash individualist habits of mind and being by treating them as a fact of human nature, the simple expression of inborn propensities. This move not only obscures the modern colonial foundations of individualist lifeways, but also promotes ignorance about their harmful consequences, such as ecological degradation, economic inequality, and so on, and also constrains imagination of more sustainable alternatives. From this perspective, the important promise or potential of an African-centering psychology is to denaturalize the whiteness of these hegemonic accounts. The view from this standpoint permits a peek under the table, if you will, to reveal the typically obscured colonial scaffolding that's necessary to support these supposedly natural modern individualist tendencies and their associated prescriptions. This can all sound very abstract, so to make things more concrete, we'll share a couple examples.
I don't know whether this is going to be less abstract, but let's try, because this is the conceptual part. We'll get to the empirical part next. A central theme in a decolonial African-centered, Africa-centered analysis is the rejection of the psychologization and or naturalization of racism, and refocus our attention on the structural and the historical roots of racism in the Euro-American modern colonial order. From this perspective, healthy psychological functioning is less about adjustment than it is about maladjustment, about disobedience and resistance to the coloniality inherent in the modern colonial order. Hegemonic psychology that we teach, many of us here, has tended to psychologize racism. For instance, by defining it in the terms of the prejudice problematic. The source of racism in these instances, the source of oppression tends to be located inside the biased, prejudiced, ignorant, or hostile individuals. In contrast to this relatively narrow view of racism as individual bias, academic perspectives outside of hegemonic psychological science have articulated a broader understanding of racism that links ideas about inferiority to structural forces, which reflect and reproduce ideologies of difference, of domination, and subjugation. Racism as ideological, as a system of ideas, and as structural, as written into and perpetuated through social structures, which seems to be what this Hampepe report is pointing to at Stellenbosch. And probably something might come out of that, that it is written in our structures, in our system, in our culture. So this has a long and intractable global and local pedigree. I can remember I mentioned a name like Norman Duncan in the 80s already, and several people in the country says this is where you might go. Outside of psychology, Neville Alexander might be one of those people turn to, and several names that one can come up with. It is apparent now, seen as a system of ideas and structural, that racism is embedded in disciplines like psychology, other disciplines, and in structures. But our stance is not a total rejection of psychology. We are employed, they employ us, we are part of psychology. In their work on the Apartheid Archive project, our comrades and friends and colleagues, Garth Stevens and Associate, offer a critical psychosocial perspective on racism. They argue that racism is equally affective and macropolitical. In constitution, it is substantiated simultaneously in intrapsychic and material formations and realities across both private and institutional spheres. Wonderful book that you might want to get for yourself if you don't have it. This broader understanding of racism resonates clearly with the decolonial perspective on the topic. A decolonial focus on the geopolitics of knowledge affords consideration to epistemic standpoints which inform conceptions of racism. Scholarship suggests that different understandings of racism as a problem of individual bias versus a structurally embedded force are not randomly distributed across people. Different people have different ideas about what racism is. Instead, research then suggests that the understanding of racism as individual bias, that is, the understanding that has prevailed around the world, in this country, in the US, in Europe, is especially pronounced among white respondents in research. White respondents are far more likely than black respondents to define the problem of racism as discrimination based on the prejudice of individuals. Black respondents, on the other hand, are more likely to define the problem of racism as discrimination built into laws and institutions. And this work comes from the Pew Research Center, 2016, but I guess we could quote a lot of work that attests to the same. So variation in conception of racism across racial groups suggests that the dominance of individualistic understandings of racism in hegemonic psychological science then is no accident. Instead, these understandings prevail because they reflect the perspectives and serve the interest of the white practitioners, the white researchers, who disproportionately constitute psychological science. You might remember the reference then back to Manganyi about his employers. With respect to interests A definition in terms of individual bias serves to define racism tamely. What it does is it tames racism and denies its determinative power as an ideological structure. An individualizing definition helps white subjects neutralize threats to individual self-worth. I got here on my own steam, sort of thing. It permits them to insulate themselves from the stigma of racist bias by locating this as a problem of a few bad apples, and it defends the integrity of a system from which white subjects continue to derive benefit. South Africans here would know this, that every year around Christmas, there'll be a racist incident, and then all of our attention is attracted to Durban or to Cape Town or something. But of course, it hides the ideological nature and structural nature of racism. With respect to perspective, and closer to a decolonial emphasis on a locus of enunciation, an individualizing definition of racism also reflects the white and weird epistemic standpoint that informs how hegemonic psychological science perceives the problem of racism. This epistemic standpoint is partly about preferential white access to the material affordances of wealth that enable a modern individualist sense of freedom from constraint and abstraction from context, which in turn promotes an overemphasis on individual choice and an underemphasis on situational or systemic determinants of action, racist and otherwise. An African-centered decolonial analysis turns the analytic lens on the phenomenon of racism in solidarity with the marginalized majority of people who are outside of the dominant Euro-American center. I think this is what hegemony means, the underside of hegemony. This preferential option is not only an ethico-political stance of solidarity, but also represents an epistemic mode of solidarity. It's about knowledge. The proposition is that one can best comprehend the human condition, including the operation of power, by treating perspectives of racially subordinated communities as privileged sites of understanding against Euro-American centric delusions of grandeur and what's been called white ignorance. Applying this strategy then to the topic of racism, an Africa-centered decolonial psychology emphasizes 4 points: the coloniality of modernity, the racism in the structure of everyday worlds, white normativity, and racism of the 0 point. I'm going to go quickly in the first two and then run to the latter two, because the first one we've discussed the coloniality, modernity, coloniality, and it forms a central idea for a decolonial Africa-centered psychology of racism and anti-racism. And we have mentioned the name of Mignolo. Given an understanding what has been called the darker side of modernity and the idea of coloniality in the air we breathe, you saw the picture of Nelson Maldonado Terrace, a decolonial African-centered analysis makes clear that Euro-American-centric racial discrimination was not limited to a discretely defined period in the past. Racial domination persists in the modern colonial present. And to many of you here and listening online, we don't have to enumerate the many examples of the racism of the modern colonial order. I'm going to leave it right there and then move on. Perhaps I should mention this last point about linguicides, because I have been reading Ngugi quite a lot lately again. We want to underline this idea of linguicides, of pestimicides, an idea that Sabelo, Kacheni Ndlovu likes, that is the destruction or near destruction of languages of and ways of knowing which are associated with and generated by so-called tribal people and other subordinated peoples on the African continent elsewhere on the globe. This is not fading with the passage of time. They continue to gain force via assimilation to Euro-American-centric modernity. An idea by Pia Salter and associates, Glenn, I think it was Glenn's student, if I'm not wrong. A second principle of a decolonial African-centered approach to anti-racism and racism is to extend the study of racism beyond the focus of individual psychology. We spoke about this. Inherent in the prejudice problematic by considering how racism is located in the structure of everyday worlds. So from this perspective, one will not find the foundation of racist bias in brain architecture or personality traits. Instead, individual propensities for racist bias exist in a dynamic relationship with structures of racist bias embedded in the stuff of everyday worlds, e.g. the monuments. I just came from Portugal, and I like one of those trips around the city. And the bus we were on was shamelessly promoting colonial plunder of Africa. I'm thinking, does anybody know about colonialism here? White normativity, I will spend a little bit more time here. The shift in focus within studies of racism from a problem of individual adjustment to an issue of oppressive realities suggests a similar shift from a focus on differential treatment to the universal imposition and naturalization of whiteness. From this perspective, racism, the racism at the heart of the Euro-American centric modern colonial global order can be seen not only in the cases where the actors or institutions subject people from different racial backgrounds to different standards. For example, subjecting black people to heightened police surveillance and brutality. Did I mention Marikana, George Floyd, you mentioned it. But also in cases of cultural racism, in which actors or institutions treat all people by the same Euro-American centric standard. Such cases of cultural racism include the imposition of standards, which is always a weird thing. I say weird again, we mentioned it. The imposition of standards of beauty or artistic expression, art, music, literature, fashion, that denigrate African forms and elevate European forms, even while appropriating. Did anybody say Picasso? Appropriating African creativity. Such cases of cultural racism also include the imposition of what Glenn was talking about, weird ways of being or knowing. There's a particular way of knowing things, including notions of, move on, ability, love, care, merit, methodological rigor, rights, choice, as just natural standards. From this perspective, racism then is less about differential treatment than it is about possessive investment. You have to invest in ways, in wide ways of being that masquerade, these ways masquerade as just as race-neutral standards of universal application. Finally, the idea of the hubris of 0 point and its related epistemology comes from Santiago Castro Gomez. That's the picture of him right there. Nice beret. This refers to the belief in the capacity for a positionless observation or view from nowhere, that you can study people, humans, human experiences, as though you are in space somewhere. And that, ironically, permits knowledge about everywhere. Related to this idea of white normativity is then related to the idea of white normativity, then is this idea of a manifestation of racism associated with the hubris of the 0 point. So reworking the idea by Castro Gomez for purposes, the racism of 0 point refers to a tendency to abstract racism from history, to portray dynamics of dominance and subordination as cases of colorblind, equipotential intergroup relations. One instance of 0 point racism is the prevalent tendency to understand racist dominance and subordination via the discourse of numerical majority and minority. I don't know about you, but when I was an undergraduate, it used to confuse me quite a lot, this idea. It really confused me. The coloniality of this construction is evident in the extent to which it assumes and imposes the particular situation of white, weird, European majority societies, ethnocentric standard. So in South Africa, this idea that the minority is oppressed by the majority, which is actually the other way around. So in contrast then to this Euro-American centric standard, a decolonial centered approach, which situates itself in African settings, affords the observation that the flow of racist domination typically runs in the opposite direction, such that a privileged minority dominates the marginalized majority. This is most obviously true in settings like us here, as I said, in South Africa, but also colonial Rhodesia, colonial Brazil, colonial India, you can name it, and several other colonial African Latin American states, where a numerical minority of European settlers, we had a talk again about settler minority, administrators imposed racist domination on a majority of indigenous inhabitants. However, it is true of the world in general that a weird minority has imposed regimes of Euro-American centric racist domination over a marginalized majority. Simply stated, the prevailing construction of racism as a majority domination or minoritization abstracts racism from history and portrays it as the exercise of identity-neutral numerical power, thereby obscuring core features of racism in a globalized Euro-American-centric modern colonial order.
So an overarching theme of our discussions of decolonial theory earlier and racism now concerns the idea that knowledge production is an important and somewhat underappreciated site for racist activity and the promotion of white supremacy. And one of the most important ways that it works to do this is through this idea of white normativity or naturalizing patterns observed in predominantly white settings. In contrast, again, an important contribution of an African-centering perspective is to denaturalize those patterns, to reveal the coloniality that is inherent in the modern individualist forms, which is the way whiteness works in psychology. And the point here is not only to illuminate the local adaptability of African models that standard accounts tend to pathologize, but also, and perhaps more important, to emphasize the costs of the standard models that typical accounts obscure. And in the case that I'm going to describe now, the case of well-being. As an example of research that works toward this goal, consider a project led by our colleagues, Annabella Osei-Tutu at the University of Ghana and Vivian Jokoto at Virginia Commonwealth University in the US. In the first investigation, the research team conducted interviews with 34 leaders from 3 religious groups in 4 different locations, each associated with a different major language of Ghana. And the general procedure here was just to ask people, what words do you use in English to convey the concept, the English concept of well-being? What words are equivalent in your language for that English concept? Responses indicated some features of local models, including good health and positive affective states or happiness, that resemble the standard construction of well-being in Whitestream psychology. But results also provided evidence for what we refer to as a sustainability orientation to well-being. In contrast to the mainstream emphasis on personal psychological growth, this orientation emphasizes material sufficiency, acute sensitivity to interpersonal embeddedness, and corresponding attention to societal obligations. You can see some of the words that people gave in some of the translation equivalents. Also in contrast to the mainstream model and its emphasis on high arousal happiness, this sustainability orientation emphasizes the low arousal positive affect that people refer to in English as peace of mind. So note that the literal translations of the words that people use to refer to peace of mind refer to a sensation of coolness associated with the body, the heart, and especially the ears, which suggests an experience of relief that one has met societal expectations, or more appropriately, social expectations. Additional evidence concerning the prominence of these understandings of well-being come from a second investigation in which we asked people to describe a situation in which their well-being increased and a situation in which their well-being decreased. There were 2 important variations in the procedure. One variation was a community sample that we drew from the same 4 regions as the first investigation. in which people completed the procedure in the context of an interview via the corresponding local language. The second variation was a sample of students drawn from the University of Ghana, in which people completed the procedure in the context of a written questionnaire, and they did so in the medium of English. To analyze responses, we coded situations for the presence of relevant themes. One broad category of interest was promotion-oriented or growth themes that constitute the hegemonic model of well-being in Whitestream psychology, specifically an emphasis on positive affect, achievement, fulfillment, and growth. For example, one participant said that their well-being increased when they gained admission to the university. I was really happy because nobody had been to the university among my female siblings, the person said. We coded this response as a case of affect because the person said they were happy, but we also coded it as a case of psychologizing because the person cited individual success as the reason for the increase in well-being. The other broad category of interest was various themes like materiality, relationality, and peace of mind, associated with local understandings of well-being in our initial investigation. And for ease of discussion, we refer to these as prevention-oriented or sustainability themes, reflecting an orientation toward maintaining contentment in situations of constraint. So, for example, one person noted that their well-being decreased when they were thinking about how to get money and how to build their own house and leave a rented house to take themselves from the quarrels and misunderstanding from that compound house situation. We coded this response as a case of the materiality theme because the person mentions insufficient resources, but also as a case of the peace of mind theme because the person mentioned disruptions from internal and external pressures that intruded on their tranquility. So here I've ranked the prominence of various themes according to the frequency with which they appeared in participants' responses. In the two leftmost columns, here, you can see that sustainability-oriented themes were indeed the most frequent in well-being situations from people in the community sample. People in the university's student sample not only indicated sustainability themes with significantly lower frequency, but they also were more likely to mention these promotion-oriented or growth themes associated with high arousal, positive affect, achievement, and personal fulfillment. And this pattern is consistent with theory and research, which holds that the cultural milieu of university settings and other affordances for modern individualist subjectivity promote an experience of freedom from material constraint and the corresponding experience of well-being in terms of personal growth and fulfillment. Again, the evidence from the first two investigations suggests the prominence in Ghanaian settings of a sustainability model of well-being. In a third investigation, for which I just analyzed the data, we compared the relative contribution to judgments of well-being, overall well-being, of these prevention-oriented sustainability components with more standard promotion-oriented or growth components. So the basic procedure is this. We had Ghanaian and American participants respond to 96 different situations, much like the ones that I just showed you in the previous slide. These situations we sampled from responses of Ghanaian and American participants to another study we had done earlier. And for each situation, the participant's job is to think about how that situation would impact their well-being, whether it would decrease or increase their well-being. We then conducted multiple regression analyses for each situation in which we predicted that those anticipated well-being changes from their ratings from participants' ratings of anticipated change along dimensions of affect, from sad to happy, peace of mind from anxious to calm, and social validation from humiliated to respected. Responses of American participants showed a pattern that resonates with dominant understandings of well-being. Specifically, anticipated changes in well-being were more a function of anticipated changes in happiness than anticipated changes in peace of mind. Anticipated changes in social validation didn't contribute much to their change, what they anticipated would happen with their well-being. Ghanaian responses deviated from this pattern in two important ways. First, anticipated changes in social validation, again, the extent to which people anticipated feeling humiliated or respected in a given situation, were a stronger predictor of their overall anticipated changes in well-being for Ghanaian participants than for American participants. Second, Ghanaian participants showed the reverse pattern from American participants. such that the anticipated changes in well-being were more a function of anticipated changes in peace of mind than happiness. Equally important, it was also true that happiness was a stronger predictor of well-being for American than Ghanaian participants, but peace of mind was a stronger predictor of well-being for Ghanaian than American participants. I should pause here to note that we observed a similar difference as a function of situation type. So recall that people responded to some situations that were increased situations and some where their well-being decreased. Somewhat regardless of the research setting, we observed that happiness mattered more than peace of mind for situations of well-being enhancement, so resembling this pattern for American participants. But peace of mind was more important than happiness for protecting well-being in situations of constraint, resembling the pattern for Ghanaian participants. Okay, in summary, the purpose of this example is to suggest the contributions of an African-centering perspective in psychological research. And a first contribution is to counteract the violence of epistemic exclusion by illuminating other mentalities and ways of being beyond the Whitestream focus on settings that are weird. A second contribution is to counteract epistemological violence by emphasizing the adaptive value of African patterns that Whitestream perspectives portray as immature or pathological. So rather than suboptimal forms, this kind of prevention-oriented sustainability model focused on peace of mind and social validation or proper relationality may be particularly adaptive for situations of constraint. It provides optimal pathways for a viable existence and recognition of global reality of embedded interdependence. As the existential threat of anthropogenic climate change makes clear, we don't inhabit a world of unlimited possibility. Instead, we share, unequally to be sure, interdependent fates on our solitary planet. In such a situation, these sustainability-oriented models are not so much suboptimal forms that require intervention as they are models that reflect important insight about the human condition and are therefore worthy of emulation in mainstream, Whitestream, hegemonic psychology. Finally, though, the third and perhaps most important contribution of the work is to counteract the violence of white normativity. Rather than a just natural pattern, this promotion-oriented emphasis on growth and fulfillment reflects particular affordances of modern colonial lifeways and the cultural ecologies of material affluence that enable them. If this Whitestream model might sometimes be conducive to optimal experience, the idea is that its optimality is not necessarily a general truth of human psychology. Instead, the mainstream model is optimal to the extent that it's adaptive for flourishing within weird ecologies of the modern colonial order. And that brings me to our overall conclusion. The move to locate Whitestream models of racism and well-being in processes of Eurocentric modernity provides a standpoint from which to contemplate the relationship to the coloniality that decolonial scholars associate with this modernity. To paraphrase Walter Rodney, writing about his classic work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, we focus on the coloniality of modern individualist lifeways because doing so provides a way to better understand the present and the future. What if the self-expansive personal growth and high arousal affect associated with modern individualism and modern individualist ways of being are dependent on baseline levels of material affluence acquired through and sustained by colonial extraction? What if these ways of being are necessarily available to only a privileged few, unsustainable if scaled up to the marginalized global majority, and dependent on heavily policed borders to maintain modern individualist standards of living within gated community enclaves? Should we understand racism less as individual prejudice and more as personal and collective investment in these modern individualist lifeways? By raising such questions, an African-centering perspective prompts us to rethink the modern individualist mentalities and ways of being that Whitestream psychology holds as standard. In particular, an African-centering perspective suggests that these ways of being are not neutral or innocent. Instead, they are inextricably implicated in a modern colonial present, and they constitute technologies for visions of human development that are oriented toward white futurity. Rather than serve as an eager participant in the proliferation of modern individualist lifeways, a responsible practice of psychology for and from African settings requires critical reflexivity about the coloniality of these lifeways. In the words of Frantz Fanon, the task of an African-centering psychology is, quote, to work out new concepts that reorient the field around habits of being that emerge from other histories and propose decolonial futures, not only for some set of ourselves, but also, as Fanon says, for Europe and for humanity. So Fanon chose those words to end his book, and it's those words we'll use to end our presentation. But first, we want to acknowledge STIAS, Ronel for the kind introduction, and our collaborators on the work that's informed the project. Thank you all.
Glenn, Kopano, thank you very much. I was struck by how Chabani Mangani's words about centering, thinking and speaking and reflecting on the world with Africa at the center was spoken 50 years ago. And you've demonstrated what that means in our current context. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm sure we'll have plenty of input and questions. First of all, let me recognize our online audience, a very healthy attendance online. Thank you for joining us. We'll take questions from the room only, but those online, please do use the chat function if you'd like to put any comments or questions to the speakers. We'll make sure to print them out and give them to them and encourage them to respond to you. But for now, let's have several questions from the room. We have about 15 or 20 minutes, so we'll be able to cover a few. This is great. Let's start with Magnus here and then Sean.
It's a piece of mind.
And please do use the microphone so that our online audience can hear you.
Thank you, and apologize in advance for maybe misunderstanding some parts. I have a question. Thank you also for an interesting lecture, for sure. I have a question about the last part. Did I understand correctly that the investigation was about change in those factors? And then, if so, did you see any trend in the response depending on the absolute initial perception of those different factors, like the initial perception of your happiness or well-being?
Yeah, Manus, you just finished your presentation earlier this week, and you said you're going to spend the rest of the time here asking difficult questions. So this is good practice for the first one. We were really getting people to anticipate or imagine what would happen. So that's one of the sort of limitations of this study. And we didn't compare it to any kind of baseline because we're just asking them to imagine how they think that situation would change.
Thanks. Next hand I saw was Sean at the back.
Thanks very much. It really is a fascinating project and paper, so thank you for the work. I guess the question is, how might you deal with what is essentially the confounder of poverty and wealth? Because I think a lot of the final examples do, this could be because of Africanness, these differences, or it could be because of a difference in comfort, poverty and wealth. And that ultimately has to do with colonial histories as well. But I guess the way of phrasing this as kind of continental embeddedness, as opposed to, I guess, and possibly I don't know quite enough about this, but I know Daniel Kahneman's research has shown that, up until a certain level of wealth, happiness is linked to more money, and then after that, it isn't. So money can't buy you happiness, but under a certain limit, it can. And so, would there be a way of, I don't know, dealing with, showing that this just isn't a question of I guess, class?
Yeah, so I would say, I think, and probably this may be where Kopano was going to go later, so I don't want to say too much about it, but I think that the first thing would be to say that the project of, as I understand it, of centering in Africa within psychology is not necessarily one of like bringing in a kind of Africanness per se, but really rather just saying what is the reality that one perceives from an African context, and how is that different from the one that the field of psychology is presuming to be the way things are, and then building a science based on that. So yes, I often ask myself the same question that you're asking about level of how much of the discussion about well-being depends on, can we just go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, and say, okay, if you fulfill these certain needs first, then you get to do these other kind of needs. And part of me, even if we want to grant that that's the case, I think that the argument here is, why is psychology oriented toward those needs that are up here? Why does it imagine that that's the human condition? And by continuing to emphasize that as a human condition, is there a colonial downside to that? In other words, does that emphasis reproduce the kinds of material insufficiency that many other people follow? What do we need to do to get a psychology that's actually a psychology of the majority of people, rather than the psychology of a weird subset?
And I can answer this from a different direction, taking off from what Len says. As it turns out, I'm doing similar studies in South Africa about, we use the other word, happiness here. So Len doesn't like that, so we didn't use it today quite a lot. And part of it, in some of the studies, is precisely this. So what does it take to be happy in a place like this? And some interesting themes come out of there. Solidarity, which is what we'd hope would come, is a big thing for some people, a small group of people. So again, it's an important part of the small group, and they tend to be, they have, if you will, their consciousness raised, these people, so they were part of movements, they're activists, so the solidarity becomes part of it. The second aspect is about the levels, the money levels. And one of the things that I never quite, well, actually I understand it, why the Reconstruction and Development Program was dropped and we went to GEAR, right? That's precisely the point, that a certain kind of thinking, modern individualist, kind of, coloniality, modernity was brought by the second administration, and this thing of fulfilling basic needs of South Africans were dropped. And I never quite got the reasoning behind that, except, I guess, austerity thinking, and having surplus. You remember we had a lot of surplus during those years of Thabo Mbeki.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. I saw Shoke and at the front.
Thank you. This is a really fascinating project. What I kept thinking was, whenever there's any talk of expanding a humanities, social science subject beyond a Western discourse, we run into what we see a kind of a theory-archive dichotomy, that you expand the archive, but the theoretical framework remains resolutely Western. That you kind of, okay, you're talking about a new group, a new subject, but the methodology, whether it's philosophical, anthropological, linguistic, mathematical, is still Western. I think Glenn has just started to answer that question, that, that in a way you need to change the parameters of psychology. So is that what is desirable, that we bring sort of African psychology into the theoretical methodology, or somehow undo the binary between theory and archive altogether, that archive can also become theory and theory can also become archive? So that, because in a way there's a kind of an epistemological mastery. The theory is the little key which unlocks the entire lock of archives, and that, of course, that key has historically always remains Western.
I was saying, this is such an exciting question, so I need to calm down. Peace of mind. So maybe Glenn will answer, because thank you. Such a fantastic question. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that Kopano said in his presentation regarding notions of what is racism, and it didn't we kind of had to move over it quickly. But in that paper, we talk about the common response to a lot of the problems with people trying to struggle, how to listen to the demands of the students who are demonstrating Rose Must Fall movement and other decolonization movements. While inclusion is usually the kind of idea, right? Diversity, inclusion, that kind of model. Let's bring people in. But when people bring in, it's often into the same kind of institution. There's no transformation of so even bringing in an archive of knowledge, if the kind of parameters through which we understand that, if we're still reading it, to use our metaphor, if we're still reading it, if the geography of knowledge is still centered in the West, then even if you're standing there and looking at an African archive, it's not going to produce the transformation. It's less about the archive in this case than it is where your feet are, where you're thinking.
And earlier on, there's several ways one could respond to this, but one of the points you point to is this theory, method, practice kind of divisions. So one way to respond is I referred to a group earlier on, the Apartheid Archive Project, where we were thinking quite a lot about the archive itself. We had a lot of pushback from the people who work with the archive, because psychologists don't work with the archive. So those historians were really unhappy about how we were thinking about the archive, which was really productive in one sense, but it meant we had to be schooled, tutored about how to think about the archive. So that was quite a productive. I think it'll be revived again because it was breaking down exactly this histories of archives, theorizing the archive, and building new archives and studying this new archive. So that was quite productive in one sense. Another part of this is, of course, my colleagues, three of them are here, and some of our students. And I think this battle is one we live with as psychologists. So if we were going to do this decolonial Africa-centric work, how does it sit next to the archive, quote unquote, the psychology archive? And I am finding, which fits in with what we presented, I'm finding in these 2 years I've been here, that there is a structure that doesn't want to move in coming into a discipline. And in spite of the welcoming space, but the structure itself doesn't move. And that affects from not just the curriculum, but all the way down, or up, if you will. The theories and how theories are thought about, the methods we use to investigate things, but also our teaching. So that, I didn't see you. So all of that means a whole lot of work that involves collaboration across, not across different individuals collaborations, but also disciplines, but also north-south and south-south. And that is a lot of work. And some of us are involved in these collaborations, trying to rethink all of that. But this is a question, as I say, it excites me so much that I can go on and just talk. Thank you for that.
We'll certainly go on with that. We have a question at the front here, and I saw Karina and Bronwyn. Am I right? So, and we'll have to end it at that. Sorry, Sharon. Please go ahead.
Hello. My name's Erica Viesma. I'm a PhD candidate at the moment. 14 years ago, I developed in my master's a new bioregional model towards sustainable socioeconomic development, where I added cultural layering into the ecological and all the environmental factors, along with the Makagian way of looking at things, to a more bioregional way of looking at things, because I felt the cultural perspective was very important. But over the last 13, 14 years, and especially the last 8, I've been more significantly looking at the social factor and how that affects things, and the coloniality of all these sorts of things and how that's affected. And I'm actually now in my PhD struggling with developing my very own methodology and conceptual frameworks towards how to study sustainability, well-being and thriving, and how one actually develops markers towards that. And I was wondering, sorry about all the backlog, but have you considered, or are you using a methodological or conceptual framework, an indigenous or African framework, while looking at these sort of factors that you're on, happiness and all these other things?
As a matter of fact, Glenn and I talked about this, was it yesterday, about ways of doing this work that we are not doing. So that's my cop-out. Right? There's ways that we are aware we are not doing because, again, once again, about the limits that some of them are self-imposed. You know, not just talking to people about metaphors or way of thinking about well-being, but going out and seeing how people are doing this work. I'm looking at Desiree because I know that part of the work is also thinking about people who are doing other kinds of work, feminist work. But yes, there are people who are doing this work, and we are just thinking about it. We haven't done it, so I'm sorry that we are disappointing there at the moment. But I'd like to talk afterwards, absolutely.
Let's do that, thank you. Karina was next.
Thanks so much, Kopano and Glenn, for a wonderful presentation. I was struck by the, in the fourth section, the strong emphasis or privileging of respect and social recognition amongst your Ghanaian participants, and the way in which you ground that then as a, I guess, an Afrocentric perspective or empirically an Afrocentric voice in terms of psychology, because I immediately thought of the work of James Gilligan and how important respect was for his participants in the States who are prison inmates, and then obviously also the work of Wakpi Long in South Africa. But I wondered then, to what extent does this North-South divide trap us in a way too simplistic frame? And where does shame, for example, sit in this research? And then secondly, what is the payoff for exclusively focusing on race as opposed to a more intersectional? And I guess that links to Sean's question, and also bringing into that intersectional frame disability. So what is the payoff there for exclusively focusing on race?
Yeah, thanks for those questions and the opportunity to address some things that are maybe explicitly, I guess. So first of all, I think I should make abundantly clear as much as I can the extent to which any particular empirical example or other kind of example, I may use the word, an adjective to describe it, but that's not like, if I say an African setting, I mean an African setting, not the African setting or African settings as some kind of thing. In fact, yeah, well, the point is just to say, look, a first level analysis is that the field is really taking a very, again, using that acronym, weird, minority, and thinking the science and beyond the science, the treatment, the happiness of people in general from that particular set of contexts. And even within the idea to say that it's US, which is also, I think you're hinting at, you know, there's a big variety there that one could map a lot of different dimensions of variation. So the point is not to essentialize any particular category. And that gets a little bit to the second point. I don't know, I suppose it's inherent in the modernity colonial framework that one privileges race, because that's the primary dimension of analysis that particular framework is speaking to. But at the same time, I think one would understand that many of the dimensions of the other kinds of ways of understanding humanity, other kinds of dimensions of difference, those are all things that dimension acts on too. So they come, for me, when I'm thinking about it, I think that they're all incorporated in that dimension of analysis. If we didn't speak to them here today, it's possibly a function of sort of trying to articulate one dimension of the way to speak about the structuring of different experience. And the other one is to think about, yeah, that we could have done, and we're thinking about doing, say, masculinity as an example of how psychology and modernity, the modernity of modern individualist subject works its way through masculinity, gender, sexuality, class, economic experience, many other different forms. So I think modern individualism as a gendered and raced construct, and that's thinking about how that comes to be and what its implications for psychology are. That's sort of where I'm coming from. But Kopano's.
Yeah, so in putting together this presentation, Karen, the last part of your question, we considered quite a bit about, so to give examples to the first two parts, so what can we do? Should we do masculinity, or should we work on racism, which we've worked with other people, and then well-being? I'm quite well aware that we spoke as though that racism and race don't intersect, and privilege race quite clearly. But as I said, that drew one answer that it drew from the work we've already done, which does bring in the intersectional elements of race and racism. So that's one part, and if by any chance we're interpreting as though racism stands on its own completely, this is our work shows that no, we do the opposite. Intersectionality is a really important way of thinking about race and racism in particular. And then when we talk about racism, for instance, white supremacy is connected to masculinist ways of being supremacist. In addition, I wanted to say something else about, but maybe I should leave it right there. What we wanted to end, where we wanted to end was to tell you about the kinds of structure of the book that we were thinking how it's going to take. So the intersections between well-being and these other things will be part of this book. So we didn't quite show them here about well-being and racism, well-being, masculinity, well-being, and we're thinking other things that we are playing with right now. So they will be part of that work.
Okay, thank you, Karina. We are well over time. I know Bronwyn had, is it okay? So, and I know there was a very burning question at the front here as well. Do you want to take one more brief? Shall we have one more brief input? Okay.
Thank you. Good day. My name is Kwazi Mazibugo, and Prof. Kopano Ratele was my lecturer last year. Just a quick question. Since Stellenbosch is a historically deeply rooted colonial space, from a psychology perspective, how do you think decoloniality can prosper?
Could I add on that? Because it's two questions. Hi everyone, it's Jimmy. I'm also a psychology student, working all together with Prof. Kopano. I wanted to join part of the conversation about the archive. My idea usually receives like, I'm always shocked, and they say I'm always shocking them. But I'm thinking, this is my view, which I'm hoping maybe in the response or from anyone in the room could shed a light a bit further on what could be done. My view is that there was an archive before colonization, before racism. Yes, I might not be able to prove it, but if we think logically, I think there was a way of viewing the world before this other new reality came in. So I wanted to say that hopefully there's positivism there, that the new archive that we are hoping to have, or the one that we're looking into having, there's a chance that it can exist because the current one is not the first one. It had to build on something, and as we're saying that colonization, racism was a system of, it was both a system and a psychological ideology. I think most of the time, maybe when we think about this new archive or maybe this new reality, we forget that our way of thinking about this new archive is also colonized, because now we're thinking of the empirical way of how does it relate to this, but we're forgetting that there probably was a system that didn't need to relate to this one. And the reason why we have this current one, probably it found a way that it does not relate to that, or it didn't like that one. Then now this takes us to the next step of maybe our new archive could focus on what is existing, what needs to be done, which could also be the case that the current one probably found itself in this position of what is it that we want to achieve, that system, and then it achieved what we have right now. Maybe our new archive could work into what could be done or what should be done. But I'm interested in saying, could we also be cautious in not using the current standard of empiricism and looking at way of things as to what should the new archive look like, if we're already saying that the current archive will. So that's the thing. If we need to think about the new archive, let it be aware that the way of thinking, the knowledge production has been captured in a way that we now think this is what reality is. But maybe if we took a step back and think what reality could be without this other one, then the last point would be that maybe it could be that we are not yet at the point where psychology is feeling new into the archive history and what. Maybe we not necessarily have the new ways or the ways to conceptualize where we need to go. As we have said that African psychology, we're talking about the centeredness, we're looking from this is how it could look at from here. But it is fairly new, and remember, we're still thinking of it in relation to the older archive that we're trying to walk away from. So maybe the moment we start to...
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
okay, thank you.
The points are well made. Thank you.
Are you asking how decoloniality flourish? Yes. How would it flourish? I have an answer for that, but I don't want to express it in public. There are pockets of people who are doing work, but it'll be a long time. I'll just give an example about how coloniality is built into the structures. Sometimes even in a welcoming space, changing things to do more decolonial work, decolonial teaching, for instance, or decolonial is hard. I'm finding it like, okay. But it's because the system is built in that way. There's a way of doing things that you find, and it's quite. And the answer I want to give you will give you outside about that. It's about the barricades anyway. As far as part of the answer, Glenn might answer part of it. It's very hard to return to the source, as Amilcar Cabral says. It's very, very hard. You can, some stuff we can go back to pre-colonial ways, but coloniality. Last sentence. Coloniality is in the air we breathe, and it's very hard to get another kind of air to breathe.
Okay, so air that we breathe, there's fortunately also something to drink and eat outside. But before we go, let's just say a very warm round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very, very much.